The ongoing escalation of the conflict between Russia and NATO-backed Ukraine has brought the risk of nuclear Armageddon back into the public conversation.
Armageddon.
Armageddon.
Nuclear Armageddon.
Vladimir Putin is not joking about using nukes.
Former CIA Director Leon Panetta cited analysis that rates the probability of nuclear weapons being used by Russia in Ukraine as having risen from 1 to 2% at the start of the conflict to 20 to 25% today. That's a 1 in 4 chance of nuclear war. But before you liquidate your assets and build a bunker in the bush, remember that these risk assessments are certainly wrong, because the world is simply too complex to make such predictions with any useful accuracy. The reality is that nobody knows what the true measurement of the risk is. And if that's calming on the one hand, on the other, it should probably be very upsetting. Because there's one element that we do know for certain, that as long as humanity possesses nuclear weapons, the risk of them being used is above zero. And in a time when the rhetoric of nuclear war is being recklessly wielded by actors of all stripes, it's worth taking a second look at the world's current nuclear environment, checking in on where the risks might lie by looking at some of the very close shaves we've had in the past, and briefly exploring what hope there is of us surviving into the future. When imagining the destructive capacity of nuclear bombs, it's hard not to immediately picture the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the only two incidents of the weapons being used in war. And while these destructions are rightly seared in our minds, their cultural weight can obscure the significance of the many massive developments in nuclear weaponry and strategy that have come since. Take a moment to guess how many nuclear weapons have been detonated. 1 each at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a couple of tests in the desert beforehand to make sure that they worked, add in some tests for every new member to the nuclear club, and throw in a couple more through the years just to make sure that they're still all up to scratch. Got a number in mind? If you said 2,000, congratulations, you nailed it. That's roughly how many times we've lit up the face of God with nuclear detonations in the decades since we figured out how to. For a point of comparison, the United Kingdom has had 57 prime ministers in its entire history, meaning we've detonated some 30 for each one. And the image of our mind's eye of the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima is way, way out of date. That nuke packed in 15 kilotons of damage, with the average US nuke today packing 20 times that, at around 300 kilotons. And the biggest weapon ever tested, Russia's Tsar bomber, came in at 50,000 kilotons of explosion. That's 3,800 times the impact of the bomb that hit Hiroshima. And to make it safe for testing, its actual destructive capacity was halved. An uninhabited village 55 kilometres from its detonation was completely destroyed, with buildings damaged 160 kilometres away. It had to be fitted with a special slowing parachute so that the pilot dropping it could have time to get away safely. The game of war has been so massively changed by these developments that we've been living under the relative safety of their umbrella ever since. After all, who would want to risk unleashing any of this? It wouldn't take the exchange of too many nukes to very quickly become a lose-lose game for all players. The world's current arsenal comprises around 13,000 weapons split across 9 states, with delivery systems ranging from sending a guy to war with a nuke in his backpack, to massive automated and simultaneous strikes from missiles, planes and submarines. The bulk of these 13,000 nuclear weapons are held by just 2 countries, classics of the nuclear genre, Russia and the United States of America, with each having some 1,500 warheads currently deployed and ready to be launched within minutes. We know these figures thanks to the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty between the USA and Russia, known as START, which allows mutual inspections and was agreed upon to limit both the number of deployed weapons and their delivery systems. Together, the USA and Russia make up some 90% of the world's nuclear arsenal, and the technological advances, launch protocols, and control treaties through the decades reflect the difficult balance for each to maintain an unassailable threat at permanent readiness and simultaneously trying to ensure that that threat is never activated. This doctrine is known as mutually assured destruction, or fittingly, MAD. It's worth noting that Russian doctrine provides for Russia to use nuclear weapons in various circumstances, including when the very existence of the Russian state is threatened, something that, against all belief, the United States of America is overtly flirting with today.
You really want to think about this. The more successful we are, the United States and its allies, at achieving our war aims, the more likely it is that the war will turn nuclear.
3 nuclear powers, the US, France and the United Kingdom, are also members of the NATO Defensive Alliance. In 1999, fellow NATO power Germany, a non-nuclear state, proposed that the organisations adopt a no-first-use policy, but that proposal was rejected. Pakistan, Russia, the USA, France and the United Kingdom oppose the idea of a no-first-use doctrine at all, meaning that they publicly maintain a willingness to use their nuclear arsenals in a first strike should they or an ally face a sufficient threat. All have various doctrinal stipulations designed to prevent the usage of their nuclear weapons in wars of aggression. For example, French policy requires that their stockpile is to be kept only at the minimum level required for deterrence. China and India hold smaller stockpiles still, with each actively pursuing a policy of no first use, whereby their nukes are ostensibly only for deterrence purposes, with each committing not to use their nukes to threaten non-nuclear states. Of course, there are very few sound mechanisms to enforce any of these doctrines or conventions, and it's easy to imagine scenarios where these error-prone human systems are overridden. Israel has never confirmed the existence of its nuclear program, though is considered to have been a member of the club since the 1960s, and presumably maintains its stock as a deterrent against the larger and often hostile states in their region. The size and nature of North Korea's arsenal is similarly opaque, and the volatility of totalitarian societies is a source of constant disquiet to rival powers. In September of this year, Pyongyang passed a nuclear policy law allowing them to conduct a preemptive nuclear strike on South Korea. They have a very active ballistic missile program and can already deliver nukes to Japan or US territories in the Western Pacific, a situation that has many observers considering the need to provide South Korea with nuclear capabilities of their own to offer an effective deterrent. As you know, it's a volatile world, and peace between human societies has not been the norm throughout history. The balance of nuclear deterrence brings us peace, but with a great complexity and uncertainty, and the combinations of potential problems that could escalate against expectation are dangerously numerous. And these are just the figures and systems that we know of publicly. At least Iraq, Libya and South Africa have all had active nuclear programs in the past, with South Africa successfully producing weapons before destroying them ahead of signing the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1991. The Non-Proliferation Treaty opened for signatories in 1968, and today covers almost the entire globe with 190 parties pledged to the mission of reducing nuclear weapon proliferation. Notably, the only states who are outside the treaty are North Korea, India, Israel, Pakistan and South Sudan, and all but the last are known nuclear powers. Despite the best efforts of much of the global community, Iran is seemingly very close to producing nuclear weapons of their own. And the chances that a non-state actor could obtain or develop a nuclear weapon is a well-explored trope in fiction because it represents a real-world anxiety based on a real-world threat. Rather than the specifics of each region, it's however the general trend that's the salient point for this video. Whether it's the number of weapons, their delivery systems, or the number of states who wield them, each additional node in the nuclear cobweb has a multiplier effect, whereby the chance that something will fall out of balance and the weapons will be used increases dramatically. Despite this precarious situation, to date, the vast majority of us have, after all, lived our entire lives in relative peace within this mousetrap. In fact, it's hard to argue against the case that many of us are able to live in peace at all only because of this threatening balance. Where war between the major powers has been a feature of human civilization, the cost has become too high now, as nobody wins in an all-out nuclear war. But how much of this long-standing peace comes through design, and how much through pure luck? Harvard professor Joseph Nye points out that even a lower-end estimate of a 1% chance of nuclear conflict breaking out at some point in the next 40 years, when extended across 8,000 years, becomes a risk of 99%. And when you're talking about both offensive and defensive systems that by design prompt the launching of entire arsenals of perceived adversaries, even an uptick from a 1% chance to 1.1% should really be met with urgent measures to cool things down. Because, without being too dramatic, even a lower-end estimate of the fallout of an all-out nuclear exchange would lead to an unimaginable number of deaths and the absolute destruction of our civilization as we know it. The type of mistake you don't want to make even once. And most likely, it would emerge from a disagreement that in contrast could only be absolutely trivial, like ownership of a piece of land, divergent religious beliefs, having the correct version of history, or perhaps grimmest of all, who has the best economic system. This may sound far-fetched given we've survived so far, because it's all too easy to become complacent to the current weight of this destructive threat. Canadian psychiatrist J.T. McCurdy analysed the German bombings of London in World War II and the population's surprising resilience in the face of such a horrible experience. He described the impact of 3 distinct responses that people would have depending on their proximity to the bombs. The first group was those who died, who don't get to relay their perspective on how serious the threat is, for the obvious reason that they're no longer around. The second group was near misses, people who were close to the bombs and carnage and were understandably traumatised by the experience. But the third group, which is of most interest here, and the largest in population by far, was the remote misses, people who heard the sirens, saw the explosions, but through circumstance managed to survive easily. This comfortable brush with the face of danger, rather than inspiring terror, surprisingly led most to feelings of excitement and a sense of invulnerability. I think that's a fair analogy to us now. After all, how would you feel if you saw somebody in the street running around saying that the end is near because Russia has some 1,500 nukes facing us right now? I doubt many of us would take too much concern. I know I wouldn't. But just because something hasn't happened yet, it's no proof that it won't. And given the stakes of the nuclear equation, our societies and leaders need to be hyper-vigilant against the default temptation to misread the risks of any nuclear escalation due to a survivorship bias. I'm not making this video to provoke any stress that the end is near. Despite my videos to date, I really am a positive and optimistic person by nature. I just think that how close we've come to world-ending disaster is dangerously under-discussed and important to reckon with, so that we can remind ourselves how close to this threat we still are. After all, only by integrating this reality into our thinking as best as we can will we be able to build and maintain the most robust systems possible to mitigate against the risk of nuclear war into the future. Given the understandably secretive nature of various military and political machinations, what we know of nuclear near misses probably only represents the tip of the iceberg. Despite that, there have been far more close encounters than you would want. Here's a few. Lakenheath Air Base in Suffolk in the UK was used by the US to store nuclear weapons and was home to at least 2 nuclear incidents during the Cold War. The first occurred in 1956 when a bomber on a routine training flight crashed into a storage unit which contained 3 nuclear weapons. Incredibly, the storage unit was kept right next to the runway so that the nukes could be loaded quickly if needed. The crash itself killed 4 airmen, with their aircraft exploding and showering the stored nukes with burning aviation fuel. This understandably triggered a panic, with people fleeing the base, and a US cable reported that it was a miracle that one of the bombs, sitting with exposed detonators, didn't explode. The bombs each had a yield 10 times greater than that of the Hiroshima bomb, and a senior US official was quoted saying that it was possible that a part of eastern England would have become a desert. In 1961, just 5 years later at the very same base, another nuclear catastrophe was almost sparked after a pilot of a plane carrying a nuclear weapon mistakenly jettisoned his fuel tanks onto the runway while stationary. This started a fire that left the nuclear weapon aboard scorched and blistered. This incident was only officially acknowledged by the British government in 2003. On the other side of the Atlantic, on the 24th of January 1961, a mere 8 days after the scorched nuke on the runway in Sussex, a US Air Force B-52 bomber flying over North Carolina suddenly experienced a loss of fuel, spiraled out of control, and crashed, killing 3 of the plane's crew and accidentally dropping 2 thermonuclear weapons in the process. One bomb was found upright and intact, with its parachute caught in a tree. The deployed parachute was a part of the weapon's launch sequence. The second bomb's parachute didn't activate, and it ploughed straight into a field below, breaking up and lodging itself 6 meters underground. More than 50 years after the accident, a Freedom of Information request revealed that 3 out of the 4 arming mechanisms of the bomb in the tree had been activated. Incredibly, attempts to excavate the second bomb proved too difficult, and Army engineers removed the bomb's pit, which is required for detonation, left the rest with its plutonium and uranium in the ground, and bought a 120-meter ring of land around it, which today is a lovely plot of trees. The yield of each bomb was 3 to 4 megatons, or more than 250 times that of the Hiroshima explosion. These accidents don't just threaten people who live near air bases, but truly threaten us all, because one key element of strategy in nuclear war is to be able to detect any incoming nuclear strikes and quickly retaliate to inflict as much damage as possible. which means that just a single small mistake can quickly compound out of control. One such close shave came during the height of the Cold War in September 1983. At the start of the month, the Soviets shot down a civilian Korean Airlines flight for straying into its airspace, killing many Americans, including Congressman Larry McDonald. In this extremely tense environment, on 26 September, an alert lit up on the computer system of Moscow's Early Warning Satellite Command Center. A missile was heading from the US toward the Soviet Union. The officer on duty, Stanislav Petrov, watched the alert come in and decided it was probably just the computer malfunctioning, as it was unlikely that the Americans would fire just the one missile. Later, the computer identified 4 more missiles simultaneously in the air, all headed from the United States towards the Soviet Union. To his endless credit and our enduring debt, Stanislav decided not to escalate these warnings up the chain of command. Soviet strategy at the time was to launch an immediate and compulsory nuclear counterattack upon the United States. President of the World Security Institute, Bruce Blair, considered the incident the closest we have come to accidental nuclear war. But as the minutes ran on and no missiles came, it was eventually determined that the warnings were indeed false and due to a malfunction of the Soviets' detection system brought about by a rare alignment of sunlight on clouds rebounding to the orbiting satellites. Where our imperfect systems can be saved by the actions of one individual, so too might they be undone. One such example occurred in 1969, when US President Richard Nixon was faced with a crisis. North Korean fighter jets had shot down an American Navy surveillance plane over the Sea of Japan. The president, incensed, ordered airmen at a US base in South Korea to prepare a nuclear strike in retaliation. Bombs were to be loaded onto planes, and plans drawn up for an attack. Apparently, Nixon was a famous drinker, and the decision to strike had been made while the president was drunk. Fortunately, then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger was able to rally senior advisors and hold off on executing the order until the morning, by which time the president was able to sober up and cool down. No such strike was ever sent. These examples are just the tips of the iceberg. There are also well-known close shaves and counter-histories. What if JFK had listened to the generals during the Cuban Missile Crisis? What if the Germans had been first to develop nukes in World War II? What if Russia and NATO directly strike each other in the current conflict? I hope that reflecting upon these questions and knowing these historical precedents can give a flavour to how fragile our systems really are and illustrate how little might have to go wrong for us to suddenly be sitting around a fire trying to figure out how to build a working Nintendo from scratch. Given very few of us either have nuclear codes in our pockets or make our wage selling plutonium to the Ayatollah, there's not too much to be done by the way of direct action. But I believe that the collective consciousness counts for a lot in democracies, and having and growing an understanding of the strategic realities that underpin our societies is an important precursor to good decision-making occurring where and when it's needed. Knowing the stakes of these games certainly changes my relationship to the idea of having highly concentrated power, endorsing the unpredictable escalation of military conflicts, or wanting to press my own beliefs onto others to the point of violence. The Non-Proliferation Treaty has done an excellent job of shoring up near-universal buy-in to the goal of reducing the risk of nuclear holocaust at the state level. When it was drafted in the 1960s, they were expecting 20 to 30 new nuclear powers to emerge in the coming decades. But the movement has so far successfully kept it to under 10. There are certainly many countries who are capable of developing nuclear weapons that don't, due to this treaty, and the uneasy umbrella of alliances that sees their deterrence needs tacitly spoken for. The Doomsday Clock has been maintained by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists since 1947 and tries to represent the destruction of our species through the metaphor of a clock counting down to midnight. I believe it does a good service of keeping issue salience in reporting on the balance of various threats as geopolitical and climatic shifts occur. Unfortunately for us, it currently reads a very ominous 11 hours, 58 minutes and 20 seconds. I support the mission of the world's denuclearization movements, who spread awareness of this problem and promote disarmament, and I've included a link to some charities in the video description. I'm not sure what to make of the goal of total nuclear disarmament, however, not least because it seems about as achievable as removing all the guns from the US. Barring a stunning reversal of our civilization, I'd say it's a Pandora's box that's been permanently opened. One difficulty in improving probabilistic risks in an environment where they haven't yet come to bite, and very likely can't be reduced to zero, is that any goal isn't going to be inherently sexy. But given the consequences of failure, it seems pretty clear that we as a species are underperforming in mitigating the risk of nuclear catastrophe. After all, even if that risk on any given day is only 1 in a million, the chance remains that one day we will crap out and roll that number. And whatever there is we can do in the meantime to get a few billion more sides on that dice seems well worth prioritising to me. I hope you enjoyed this video. It takes me dozens of hours to research, write, record and produce these, and it's work I couldn't do without the generous support of my patrons on screen, with a special thanks to my new VIP patron, David Hawken. If you'd like to support the channel, please do like, subscribe, and leave a comment, and I'd love it if you'd consider joining up as a patron yourself. Thanks again, stay safe out there, and I'll see you next time.